Somebody drag this animal back to whatever hole he crawled out of before he stinks up my courtroom." Officer Derek Harlan didn't whisper it. He didn't mutter it under his breath or hide it behind a cough. He said it loud enough that the fluorescent lights above seemed to flicker with the sheer weight of his contempt, loud enough that the court clerk stopped typing mid-sentence, loud enough that a 5-year-old boy in the third row tugged his mother's sleeve and asked a question that would haunt this room long after the gavels stopped falling. What Harlan didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, was that the man he'd just called an animal held a title that could bring this entire building to its knees with a single phone call. But that revelation was still an hour away, and for now the laughter was just getting started. The Ridgemont County District Court opened its Monday session the way it always did, with the stale heaviness of a building that had stopped caring about justice sometime around the second coat of paint peeling from its water-stained ceiling. The air inside courtroom number 4 carried the familiar smell of old paper and institutional neglect, the kind of damp staleness that clings to places where too many lives have been reduced to file numbers and forgotten before lunch. Pale fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting a yellowish light that made everyone look slightly ill, and the wooden benches lining the gallery had been worn smooth by decades of anxious hands gripping them during verdicts that were usually decided long before anyone bothered to sit down. Half the seats were occupied that morning mostly by court staff who treated the proceedings like background noise, a few interns scribbling in notebooks they'd never open again, and a cluster of uniformed officers from the local police department who sat together near the back like spectators at a game they already knew the score of. Everything was quiet. Everything was routine. The kind of Monday that promised nothing and delivered less. Then the side door swung open without warning and 2 security officers stepped through. First, their faces arranged into the kind of exaggerated seriousness usually reserved for escorting someone who might detonate at any moment. Between them walked a black man. He was not handcuffed, but the officers flanked him so tightly that the absence of restraints almost made it worse, as if the proximity itself was the restraint, as if his very existence in this space required containment. His white shirt was wrinkled in the way that only comes from hours of sitting in cold rooms with no explanation, and on his collar just below the left side of his jaw, there was a dark stain, dried blood, not fresh, not dramatic, but visible enough that anyone who looked at him closely would notice it, and wonder, though nobody in this room seemed inclined to wonder about anything concerning this man. He walked with his back straight and his eyes fixed on a point ahead that didn't exist yet, the still empty judge's bench, as though he could see through walls and time and the accumulated indifference of every person pretending not to watch him. His gaze held no anger, no pleading, no performance of any kind. It was the stillness of deep water, the kind that makes you uneasy, not because of what you can see, but because of what you know must be underneath. He didn't glance sideways, didn't nod, didn't flinch when a woman in the front row released a small sigh of pity that she probably thought was quiet enough to be private. The officers guided him to the defendant's chair, nodded once to each other, and stepped back, leaving him alone at the center of a room that had already decided what he was. No one knew his name. The court clerk, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a habit of scanning every file twice, stared at the folder in front of her and found it almost empty. No residential address, no guarantor listed, no recorded occupation, no prior criminal record. She murmured something to the technical assistant beside her too softly for anyone to catch the words, but her expression was unmistakable. The raised eyebrow, the slight pull at the corner of her mouth, the look of someone who has just encountered an anomaly and doesn't like it. Judge Roland Pryor appeared a few minutes later, entering from the rear chamber with the stiff, unhurried walk of a man who had been sitting behind desks for so long that his body had forgotten how to move with purpose. He was white, mid-60s, with a face reddened by some persistent nasal condition, and hands that moved with the mechanical precision of someone who had memorized every gesture of authority without understanding what any of them meant. He settled into his chair, picked up the first page of the file, looked down, then up at the defendant, then down again, as if the paper might have changed in the 2 seconds he'd looked away. He flipped to the second page. There was no second page. He rotated his pen slowly between his fingers, tapped the microphone once with his knuckle, and said flatly, "The trial begins." 5 seconds of silence followed. Not the kind that precedes an argument or the kind that follows a revelation, but the dull, empty quiet of a room where nobody expected anything to happen, where the script had already been written, and everyone was just waiting for the closing credits. And then, cutting through that, nothing like a small, bright knife. A child's voice rose from the third row of the gallery. "Is he a bad guy, Mom?" Every head turned. A boy of about 5, curly-haired and wide-eyed, with the devastating honesty that only children possess, was tugging at his mother's hand and pointing directly at the man sitting alone in the defendant's chair. His mother, a black woman named Nina, who had come to observe a cousin's minor traffic hearing later that morning, blushed deeply, pulled her son against her side, and bowed her head as if the question itself was something to be ashamed of. But it was too late. The question hung in the air like a flare, illuminating the room's unspoken assumptions in a way that no legal argument ever could. In the back row, an older black man named Arthur Givens, 64, retired history teacher, crisply ironed shirt wire-rimmed glasses, watched the boy point and felt something tighten behind his ribs. The child's outstretched finger reminded him of another hand, smaller now in memory, but just as innocent, reaching for his own on a summer afternoon 6 years ago when his grandson Terrence, then 17, had been pulled from a bus stop in handcuffs, while Arthur stood on the sidewalk across the street, close enough to see everything and too far away to stop any of it. He carried a photograph of Terrence in his wallet, creased at the corners from years of being taken out, and put back a school portrait showing a boy with his whole life balanced on the edge of a smile that Arthur hadn't seen since. He gripped the bench now and set his jaw because the scene unfolding in front of him was not new. It was the same scene replayed in a different room with a different man, and the same laughter rising like bile from the same kind of throats. Harlan was the first to laugh. It started as a chuckle, low and self-satisfied, the kind of sound a man makes when the world keeps confirming what he already believes. Then another officer behind him joined in. Then a third. "If you look at that face and don't see a problem," Harlan said, gesturing toward the defendant with his chin, "then I need to get you an eye exam." The laughter spread like something spilled, moving from row to row, from uniform to uniform, filling the courtroom with a sound that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with power, confirming its own reflection. The man in the defendant's chair did not move. Not a muscle in his face shifted. Not a finger twitched. He sat there with the same stillness he had carried through the door, the same silence, the same gaze that seemed to look through everything and everyone, as if the laughter itself was simply weather, something that happened around him but could never reach him. Derek Harlan had the kind of presence that filled a room sideways, not through authority, but through sheer physical insistence, the way he stood with his feet too far apart and his chest pushed forward, the way his pale blue eyes scanned every face for the flicker of submission he'd trained himself to expect. His platinum blonde hair was buzzed tight on the sides and left just long enough on top to catch the courtroom's sickly light, and his badge, always polished to a mirror finish, sat on his chest like a small throne. 11 years on the force had taught him exactly one lesson, and he'd learned it so completely that it had replaced every other instinct in his body. People who are afraid of you will do what you say, and people who do what you say are proof that you deserve to be feared. He walked to the center of the courtroom now, not because he'd been called, not because the proceedings required it, but because the empty space near the defendant's bench was simply too much of an invitation for a man who had never met a room he didn't feel entitled to command. He held a file in his hand, thin as a pamphlet, and raised it in the air as if it were Exhibit A in the trial of a man already convicted by the color of his skin. "I'd like to read the defendant's personal record," Harlan announced, his voice carrying the slow, exaggerated cadence of someone who knows he's performing, "just to make things clearer for everyone here." No one objected. The judge didn't intervene. A few officers in the back nodded as if this were standard procedure, which it was not. and Harlan took their silence as applause. He opened the file, glanced sideways at the defendant, and began reading with a sarcasm so thick it could have been measured by weight. No occupation, no education on record, no fixed address, no emergency contact. He paused, let the list hang in the air like an indictment, then looked up at the gallery with the expression of a man delivering the punchline to a joke only the worthy could appreciate. What a model citizen we have here, ladies and gentlemen. The laughter came faster this time, looser, as if the first round had been a rehearsal, and now the audience knew the rhythm. Officers nudged each other. A court staffer covered her mouth, but her shoulders shook. Somewhere near the window, a man muttered something about Denzel Washington that made the three people around him convulse with laughter so sudden that one of them knocked a paper cup off the bench and nobody bothered to pick it up. From the gallery seats reserved for observers, a group of law students watched with the gleaming arrogance of young people who had studied just enough to believe they understood the world. One of them, a young man with hair bleached to a platinum gray that looked almost white under the fluorescent lights, slapped his thigh 3 times in rapid succession and shouted loud enough to turn heads. "Who invited the clown to court? Is this a courtroom or an acting class?" Nods followed like dominoes. Laughter rolled through the rows like steel balls across marble, picking up speed, gaining mass, becoming something heavier than sound. And behind Harlan, sitting 2 rows back with his arms folded across his barrel chest and a grin spreading slowly across his ruddy face, was Sergeant Troy Beckham. He was everything Harlan might become in 20 years if he kept feeding the same appetites thicker around the middle, slower in the legs, but sharper in the particular skill of knowing exactly when to look the other way. Beckham had been Harlan's supervisor for 6 of those 11 years, and in that time he had built a quiet empire of complicity, not by giving orders, but by making sure certain orders were never given. When complaints about Harlan landed on his desk, Beckham signed them away with 2 words resolved internally and moved on to the next barbecue invitation. Now he sat watching his protégé perform, and when a younger officer near the aisle hesitated, his laughter dying in his throat, as if some residual instinct toward decency had momentarily surfaced. Beckham caught his eye and gave a slight nod, barely perceptible, the kind of gesture that means go ahead without ever needing to be spoken aloud. The younger officer laughed again, louder this time, and whatever had flickered behind his eyes disappeared as quickly as it had come. Through all of it, the man in the defendant's chair remained as still as a photograph of himself. His hands rested on his thighs, palms down, fingers relaxed. His spine held its line as if it had been set in concrete before he entered the room. His breathing was slow, measured, almost imperceptible, the kind of breathing that belongs to someone who has trained themselves to wait to absorb, to let the world show itself before deciding how to respond. His eyes maintained a steady, frozen focus, not on Harlan, not on the judge, not on the laughing students or the grinning officers, but on something beyond all of them, some fixed point in a distance that no one else in the room could see. The silence of the defendant did not go unnoticed. It went unexplained, and that was infinitely worse. In a courtroom built on the expectation that the accused will protest grovel rage or collapse his absolute refusal to do any of these things, created a void so profound that it made the laughter around him sound hollow, tinny like coins rattling inside an empty can. His stillness was not passive. It was structural. It held weight. It was like a thick pane of glass placed at the exact center of the room, and every word, every joke, every sneering comment bounced off its surface and reflected back at the speaker, showing them exactly what they looked like in the act of mocking a man who would not blink. But not one person in that courtroom was sharp enough to see their own reflection. Not yet. Arthur Givens gripped the edge of the bench with both hands, his knuckles going pale beneath dark skin, his jaw set so tight that the muscles in his temples pulsed visibly. He had come to court that morning for a nephew's minor sentencing hearing, had arrived early, had planned to sit quietly and leave quietly, the way a 64-year-old retired history teacher does most things. But what he was watching now was not a trial. It was a demonstration, and every year of the history he had taught every chapter about dignity being stripped from people who looked like him was alive in this room wearing badges and laughing as if cruelty were a sport they'd been training for their entire careers. His hand moved unconsciously to his breast pocket where the photograph of Terence lived against his heartbeat, and he pressed it there as if holding a wound closed. Arthur Givens stood up slowly the way a man stands when he knows that what he's about to do will cost him something, but has decided the price of staying seated is higher. His chair creaked against the tile floor, and the sound small as it was cut through the laughter like a crack appearing in a wall that everyone assumed was solid. He was not a large man, but his posture carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years standing in front of classrooms full of teenagers and commanding their attention without ever raising his voice above a conversational register. His shirt was pressed with the kind of precision that only men of a certain generation bother with anymore, each crease deliberate, each button aligned, and his wire-rimmed glasses caught the fluorescent light as he turned his gaze toward the group of law students who had been laughing loudest. "Do you think this is a joke?" he said, and his voice was not loud, but it carried the density of something forged under pressure. Each word weighted with a lifetime of watching scenes like this unfold in classrooms, on television, in the streets of his own neighborhood, and always being told that the appropriate response was patience. What you're laughing at right now is not a file with missing information. It is not an empty record. What you are laughing at is the right to exist, the right of a man to sit in that chair and be treated as if he is human before he is proven to be anything else. The air in the courtroom froze for exactly one beat, one single suspended moment in which the laughter died in every throat simultaneously, and the only sound was the electric hum of the lights above buzzing like insects trapped in amber. A few of the law students glanced at each other, their smiles faltering, their hands suddenly unsure of where to rest. The platinum-haired one opened his mouth as if to fire back a retort, then closed it again, something in Given's gaze making the words dissolve before they could form. But the moment lasted only that long. One beat before it was broken by the heavy footsteps of a uniformed officer moving through the gallery toward Givens with the practiced efficiency of someone who has removed inconvenient people from rooms many times before. No questions were asked, no clarification was offered. The officer simply raised one hand in the universal gesture of institutional authority and said flatly, "Sir, you're disturbing public order. Please step outside." Givens removed his glasses. He looked at them for a long moment, as if consulting with something only he could see in the lenses, then folded them carefully and placed them in his breast pocket, right next to the photograph of Terence. He stood the rest of the way up, straightened his shirt, and stepped into the aisle without resistance. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the officer who had asked him to leave. But as he passed the row of law students, he turned his head just enough to leave behind a gaze that settled over them like a sentence they would not understand until much later. A look that said, in a place where reason drowns beneath laughter, "It is character that washes away first, and yours just went down the drain." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the courtroom exhaled. And then, as if his removal had been a signal rather than a silencing, the mockery resumed at a volume and intensity that exceeded everything that had come before, as if the brief interruption of conscience had only made the need to laugh more urgent, more desperate, more necessary to prove that what they were doing was acceptable. Because if a man who objected could be removed and the laughter could continue, then the laughter must be right. That was the logic. That was always the logic. Harlan, who had paused during Given's speech with the barely concealed irritation of someone whose performance has been upstaged, now reclaimed the center of attention with renewed energy. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and held it up toward the gallery like a man about to share a revelation. "All right. You want to see something? Watch this," he said, and tapped the screen. Body cam footage appeared grainy but unmistakable. A nighttime arrest, flashing lights. The defendant thrown to the ground with his arms raised in compliance. The barked command of resisting. He's resisting, overlapping with a kick, a scream, and then nothing. The screen went black. Someone in the gallery leaned forward. "That's it." Harlan grinned, the kind of grin that has nothing behind it except the pleasure of knowing you will never be held accountable. Tech guys say that part's corrupted. Perfect timing, right? A young court clerk muttered loudly enough to be heard by everyone nearby. "Yeah, well, corrupted is just the new word for edited." He stepped outside for a moment, returned with his own phone already cued to another clip. This one recorded that very morning from the audience. Benches capturing the defendant's entrance in decent quality, the fluorescent light catching on the dried blood stain like a mark of fate. Add a laughing filter, the clerk said, thumbs moving across the screen. Slap on some TikTok music. Title it, "This Morning's Black Show." Boom. Viral. The courtroom erupted. Whistles, soft applause, people standing to get a better view. A security team captain leaned close to a female staffer and whispered, "Bet you this guy played a corpse on Law and Order." And the woman burst out laughing so hard she had to dab at her mascara, breathless, as she added, "Yeah, but a corpse with expressive eyes." Judge Pryor heard the TikTok music bleeding from the clerk's phone, the tinny mocking beat unmistakable even at low volume. His hand moved toward the gavel. His fingers wrapped around the wooden handle, and for one fraction of a second, the muscles in his forearm tensed with the instinct to bring it down, to restore order, to do the single thing his position required of him in this moment. Then his eyes drifted to the officers laughing in the gallery, to Beckham's approving nod, to the row of faces that belonged to the same network of power that had sustained his career for 30 years, and his hand relaxed. He set the gavel down, picked up a pen instead, and began writing something on a blank sheet of paper, with the concentrated attention of a man who has decided that the most important thing happening in his courtroom is whatever is on the page in front of him. It was not inaction. It was a choice, the choice to look away, performed with the deliberate precision of someone who understood exactly what he was refusing to see. Clara Jennings, the court reporter, sat at her small desk with her fingers frozen above the keyboard. She had stopped typing several minutes ago. She was not laughing. She was watching, and what she saw made something inside her chest tighten in a way that felt like shame, even though she had not said a word, had not joined the mockery, had not done anything except exist in this room alongside people who were doing something terrible and choosing not to stop them. She understood with the clarity that comes only from witnessing something you know you should prevent, but won't that? Her silence was not neutrality. It was a vote. And the man in the defendant's chair through all of this, the body cam footage, the TikTok edit, the laughter that now shook the room like a physical force, remained exactly as he had been since the moment he sat down. Unmoved, unblinking, present in a way that made everyone else's presence feel performative. But for one fleeting instant, so brief that only someone sitting very close would have caught it, a narrow glint passed across his eyes, sharp and cold like the edge of a blade catching light before it is drawn. Clara Jennings saw it. She was close enough. And the chill that ran through her body in that half-second was unlike anything she had ever felt in a courtroom, because it was the chill of realizing that the person everyone in this room believed to be powerless might be the only one who actually understood what was happening. She looked away. She said nothing, and the laughter continued. Beneath the defendant's chair, resting against his left ankle in the shadow where the fluorescent light couldn't quite reach, sat a black briefcase. It was not large, not attention-grabbing, not the kind of object that announces itself in a room full of noise and movement. It was matte leather worn at the corners in the way that only comes from years of being carried by someone who carries it everywhere, and its brass latch had the dull patina of metal that has been opened and closed 10,000 times without ceremony. It had been there since the defendant sat down, and nobody had given it a second thought, because nobody in this courtroom was in the business of noticing things that didn't confirm what they already believed. An officer walking past the defendant's bench on his way to refill his coffee knocked the edge of the briefcase with his boot. Not hard, just enough to make it shift an inch across the tile. He glanced down, smirked, and said without breaking stride, "What's in the bag, buddy?" "Your lunch." The three officers within earshot laughed, the easy automatic laugh of men who have forgotten what it's like to consider whether something is actually funny before responding to it, and Harlan, still standing near the center of the room, added from across the aisle, "Probably his whole life savings in there. What do you think, a 20 and some food stamps?" More laughter. The briefcase was nudged again, lighter this time, almost dismissive, the way you might push aside a piece of trash on a sidewalk. The defendant did not react. He did not reach down to straighten the briefcase. He did not look at the officer who had kicked it. He did not adjust his posture or tighten his jaw or show in any way visible to the human eye that the object beneath his chair held anything more valuable than the lunch they imagined. His stillness around that briefcase was absolute, and if anyone in the room had been paying the kind of attention that silence demands, they might have noticed something strange about the way he didn't react. Not the blankness of someone who doesn't care, but the deliberate control of someone who cares very much and is choosing with every fiber of discipline he possesses to wait. Judge Pryor leaned toward his microphone and attempted to steer the proceedings back into something resembling legal order. His voice came out dry and rushed, the voice of a man who has lost control of his own courtroom and is trying to pretend otherwise. "Do you request a court-appointed attorney?" The defendant did not speak. He simply shook his head once, a single firm movement, decisive and final. "Self-representation." Pryor pressed. Another nod. Pryor's pen tapped against the bench twice unconsciously. "You confirm for the record that you will represent yourself in this court." And then the man spoke. For the first time since he had entered this room, past the laughing officers, past the TikTok videos, past the child's question, and the old man's protest, and the kicked briefcase, and the body cam footage that conveniently went black at the exact moment it mattered most, Isaiah Blackwell opened his mouth and released 4 words into the air. "I will represent myself." His voice was deep, steady, and carried none of the qualities the room had been expecting. It was not loud. It was not soft. It was not angry, pleading, defiant, or broken. It was simply present in the way that bedrock is present beneath the soil, in the way that gravity is present beneath your feet, so fundamental and so certain that it required no emphasis to be felt. The microphone on the judge's bench hummed faintly, as if the sound waves from those 4 words had a frequency that the equipment wasn't designed to handle. The last syllable landed in the silence that followed like the lid of a stone coffin settling into place, heavy, final, and impossible to reopen. Nobody said a word. For perhaps 3 full seconds, which in a courtroom that had been howling with laughter felt like an eternity, nobody said a single word. Then Pryor cleared his throat. "Do you have anything to present before the indictment is read?" The defendant met the judge's eyes, a direct, unhurried shift of attention, and the look that passed between them lasted exactly long enough for Pryor to lean back in his chair by half an inch, a retreat so small that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed it. "No." That single syllable struck differently than the previous 4 words. It was the no of someone who has decided that the tools being offered are beneath him, that the game being played in this room is not his game, and that every person sitting in judgment of him is operating under assumptions so fundamentally mistaken that correcting them would be a waste of his time. On the back bench, a law intern with blonde hair had been writing furiously in his notebook. But when the defendant said no, the pen slowed, then stopped. After a long pause, he scribbled a single crooked line in the bottom margin written from a place of doubt rather than certainty. "This is not a normal man." Clara Jennings's pen chose that precise moment to slip from her fingers. It fell to the floor with a small plastic clatter, rolled along the tile, and came to rest directly beneath the defendant's feet, inches from the black briefcase that nobody had thought to look inside. She bent down to retrieve it, and as she reached forward, her eyes lifted and met his. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But what she saw in those 2 seconds would stay with her for months, surfacing at odd moments while driving, while lying awake at 3 in the morning, trying to understand why a courtroom she had worked in for 4 years had suddenly felt like a place she should have run from. His eyes held no threat, no anger. But there was a depth to them that made her feel as though she were looking into something vast and still, a column of cold water descending into darkness, and she was standing at the edge, realizing only now how far down it went. Her hand trembled. She forced a smile. She picked up the pen, turned back to her desk, and resumed typing with fingers that would not stop shaking. A door guard tilted his head toward his colleague and whispered, "His face isn't reacting." "But I don't know, something feels off." The colleague smirked. "Off because you're soft. Don't let a stare shake you. Just keep laughing." But the guard didn't laugh. He just looked at the man in the defendant's chair and at the briefcase beneath his feet and felt in his gut the very specific unease of someone who has just realized they might be standing on the wrong side of something much larger than they understand. The laughter had not died, but it had changed shape, curdling from the loose performative amusement of the earlier minutes into something tighter, more agitated, more desperate to sustain itself. Because the longer the man sat there without reacting, without speaking, without giving them anything they could use to justify the noise they were making, the more the noise itself began to feel like evidence of something no one wanted to name. In a courtroom built on the architecture of power, the raised bench, the black robes, the gavels and microphones and armed officers, every mechanism depended on one fundamental assumption: that the person in the defendant's chair would behave like a defendant, that they would protest or cower or rage or weep or collapse into some recognizable shape that confirmed the authority of everyone around them. But Isaiah Blackwell did none of these things, and his refusal to perform the role they had cast him in was creating a vacuum that the room could not fill with anything except increasingly frantic mockery. Harlan felt it. He would not have been able to articulate it, would not have recognized it as the slow erosion of control that it actually was. But he felt it in the restless shifting of his weight from one foot to the other, in the way his jaw clenched and released and clenched again, in the itching, needling sensation that crawled up his spine every time he looked at the defendant and found those same unblinking eyes staring at exactly nothing. The silence was a provocation. It had to be. In 11 years of policing, Harlan had learned to interpret every human behavior through a single lens: compliance or resistance. And this man's absolute stillness fit neither category, which meant it had to be confronted, which meant someone had to make this man respond, because a man who does not respond cannot be controlled, and a man who cannot be controlled is a threat regardless of what the file says or doesn't say. Beckham watched from his seat with the patient, calculating gaze of a man who has spent his career knowing exactly when to intervene and when to let gravity do its work. He did not stand. He did not speak. But when Harlan began walking toward the defendant's bench, Beckham's eyes followed with the quiet approval of someone watching a dog he'd trained approach its target. This was how it worked. This was how it had always worked. The officer advances. The suspect flinches. The flinch becomes justification. The justification becomes a report. The report becomes another line on a performance evaluation. Beckham had signed hundreds of those reports. He had never lost a minute of sleep over any of them. Harlan stopped directly in front of the defendant, close enough that his shadow fell across the man's face, close enough that anyone watching would understand this was not a procedural interaction, but an act of physical intimidation performed in full view of a judge who chose to look at his papers instead. "Stand up," Harlan said, his voice no longer carrying the playful mockery of the earlier performance, but something colder now, something that lived in the part of his throat where commands are formed and humanity is left at the door. "Don't make us lay hands on you." No attorney objected because there was no attorney. No judge spoke because Judge Pryor was studying his fingernails with the concentrated attention of a man who has perfected the art of not seeing what is directly in front of him. The gavel still resting exactly where he had set it down. untouched a tool that existed to stop exactly this kind of moment, and that he had chosen deliberately, consciously, to leave where it was. The courtroom, which was meant to be the last line of defense between a citizen and the arbitrary exercise of power, had become instead a theater of exactly that exercise, its walls and benches and sworn officers serving not as protections but as scenery. The defendant did not stand. He did not shift. He did not look up at Harlan, did not acknowledge the command, did not give any indication that he had heard it at all. His hands remained on his thighs. His back remained straight. His breathing remained invisible. He was in that moment the most still object in the room, more still than the bench he sat on, more still than the gavel, gathering dust on the judge's desk. And his stillness was so complete that it seemed to generate its own gravity, pulling the attention of every person present toward the unavoidable question of what would happen when an unstoppable force met an object that simply refused to move. Beckham leaned forward an inch in his seat. His arms still crossed, but something behind his eyes had sharpened the way a predator's focus sharpens when it senses that the next few seconds will determine everything. Harlan's hand rose. His fingers stretched toward the defendant's shoulder, the gesture halfway between a grab and a push, loaded with the muscle memory of 1,000 previous arrests where this exact motion had preceded compliance, or when compliance didn't come something worse. His fingers were 6 inches from the fabric of the wrinkled white shirt, then 4 inches, then 2 close enough to see the dark stain of dried blood on the collar, and not care what it meant. The room held its breath. Clara Jennings stopped typing. The law intern stopped writing. The 5-year-old boy pressed his face into his mother's arm. The door guard, who had felt something wrong, uncrossed his arms and shifted his weight to the balls of his feet, ready for something he couldn't name. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their buzzing as if the building itself was waiting. And the defendant's eyes, still fixed on that invisible point in the distance, did not move. The sound was small. So small that if you had been coughing or shifting in your seat or whispering to the person next to you, you would have missed it entirely. A soft click like a latch being released on a jewelry box or the safety mechanism of something precise being disengaged. It came from beneath the defendant's chair, from the direction of the black briefcase that had been kicked and mocked and dismissed as someone's sad little lunch container. And it stopped Derek Harlan's hand in midair as completely as if a wall of glass had materialized between his fingers and the defendant's shoulder. Isaiah Blackwell moved for the first time. Not quickly. Not dramatically. His right hand descended from his thigh, traveled down past his knee with the controlled slowness of someone performing a gesture they have rehearsed until it became sacred, and found the brass latch of the briefcase without looking. His fingers pressed it. The latch released, and the top of the briefcase opened just wide enough for his hand to reach inside. No one in the courtroom could see what was in there. The angle was wrong. The light was wrong, and besides, most of them were still frozen in the particular paralysis that occurs when a script they thought they knew suddenly changes direction. His hand emerged, holding something that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in a cold, precise flash. It was metal. Silver-rimmed, mounted on a backing of dark blue, and bearing an eagle insignia so finely detailed that even from across the room its authenticity was unmistakable. This was not a printed card, not a laminated ID from a costume shop, not the kind of desperate prop that defendants sometimes produce in the hope that confusion might buy them time. This was an object forged by the federal government of the United States, and the letters stamped beneath the eagle read in a typeface that has not changed in 60 years. Isaiah Blackwell, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He held it at chest height, not raised above his head like a trophy, not thrust forward like a weapon, but held with the same quiet steadiness with which he had held everything else in this room. His silence, his posture, his gaze. He held it the way you hold a mirror in front of someone who has never seen their own face. The room did not gasp. That would have required the ability to breathe, and for approximately 4 seconds not a single person in that courtroom drew air. The silence was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something so heavy that sound could not exist alongside it the way a black hole consumes light. Every whisper, every chuckle, every clever remark about Denzel Washington and Law and Order corpses and TikTok clown filters died in the throats that had birthed them. And what replaced them was a ringing, crystalline quiet that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing with perfect clarity that you have been walking toward this edge for a very long time. Agent Donnelly, who had been sitting among the spectators for the past 90 minutes in plain clothes indistinguishable from any other observer, rose from his seat. He did not rise in shock. He rose the way a soldier rises when a commanding officer enters a field tent with purpose, with recognition, and with a deep, deliberate bow that communicated something to every person in the room who had eyes to see it. This man is not what you thought he was. This man is what you were afraid he might be. Harlan's face underwent a transformation, visible in real time, like watching a building collapse from the inside out. The blood left his cheeks first draining downward, as if pulled by a force stronger than gravity, leaving his skin the color of wet paper. His pale blue eyes widened to a diameter that made them look almost childlike, except there was nothing innocent in them, only the dawning, sickening recognition of a man who has just discovered that the animal he's been kicking is the one holding the leash. His hand, the hand that had been reaching for the defendant's shoulder, was still suspended in the air between them. Fingers half curled, and he could not seem to bring it back to his side, as if the muscles had disconnected from his brain and were operating on the last instruction they'd received, frozen in the act of a touch that would now define the rest of his life. Behind him, Beckham's grin did not fade so much as melt, the expression sliding off his face like wax from a candle held too close to a flame, leaving behind something raw, and exposed the face of a man who has spent decades building walls of plausible deniability, only to watch every single one of them come down in the time it takes to open a briefcase. The law students in the gallery had turned to stone. The platinum-haired one who had shouted about clowns and acting classes was gripping the bench in front of him with both hands, his knuckles white, his mouth open in a shape that was trying to form a word and failing, because there is no word in any language for the specific feeling of having publicly mocked the most powerful law enforcement official in your country, and only now understanding what you have done. Judge Pryor had sunk so far into his chair that he appeared to be trying to merge with the leather. His hand was resting on the gavel. The gavel he had chosen not to use 5 minutes ago. The gavel that could have stopped the TikTok music. The mockery, the approaching hand, and the contact between his palm and the wood felt in this moment less like holding a tool and more like gripping the evidence of his own failure. His lips moved, forming shapes without sound, and the only words that emerged, muttered so quietly that only the microphone picked them up, were, "No way. No way." And then Isaiah Blackwell spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He simply opened his mouth and released 7 words into the air with the same calm, measured precision with which he had said, "I will represent myself," and no 7 words that landed in the chests of every person in that courtroom, like a blade placed so gently against the skin that you don't feel it cutting until the blood appears. You should have stayed as silent as I did. It was not a threat. It was not revenge. It was a diagnosis, a description of the disease they had all just demonstrated in front of the one person most qualified to catalog its symptoms. His silence had been a mirror, and they had spent an hour staring into it, not recognizing their own reflections, performing the fullest possible expression of who they really were in the presence of someone who had given them every opportunity to choose differently, and watched without blinking as they chose this. No one moved. No one apologized. Because every person in that room understood with the bone-deep certainty that accompanies the worst realizations of a life that any word they spoke now would be a lie dressed in the language of remorse, and the man sitting in front of them had just proven without effort, without argument, without raising his voice above a conversational register that he could tell the difference. While the courtroom still sat in that airless, frozen silence, things were already moving in rooms that most of the people present didn't know existed. In a small technical annex separated from the main courtroom by a single corridor and a door marked Authorized Personnel Only, a staff technician received a routine request to pull up the defendant's file. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with efficient speed, but when the screen refreshed, a red-bordered warning box appeared vivid and pulsing. Classified Security Code G-51, Access Denied. She tried again with higher-level credentials. This time, the screen locked her out entirely. A sharp electronic tone sounded, followed by a message that filled the entire display. Your account has been suspended due to unauthorized access attempt. Red priority data sector. Her hand was still on the mouse, her index finger trembling against the plastic. A colleague approaching from behind saw the screen and stopped walking, his expression shifting from casual amusement to something that looked a great deal like fear. The system inbox blinked an internal email from a Washington identifier. No subject, no signature. Maintain current state. Do not ask. The domain was .gov with an internal verification hash that was unforgeable. Nobody touched another key. The screen powered itself down after 20 seconds, returning to black. Back in the courtroom, the far door opened without announcement. 3 men entered. The state chief of police, not in uniform but in a charcoal gray suit, followed by 2 men in dark suits with close-cropped hair and sunglasses worn indoors. None of them spoke. The judge stood immediately with the abrupt, startled movement of someone caught doing something wrong. The police chief walked to the center of the courtroom, and every officer who had been laughing straightened their spines as if yanked upright by invisible strings. One of the 2 men in dark suits reached inside his jacket and withdrew a thin object, held it in his open palm for exactly 3 seconds, angled toward the judge's bench before returning it to his jacket. No explanation given. None needed. Harlan, still standing near the defendant's bench with his hand half raised and his face the color of cold ash, turned to the officer nearest him and whispered, "What the hell is going on?" The officer didn't answer. Nobody did. Isaiah Blackwell stood. For the first time in over an hour, he rose from the defendant's chair, and the motion was so unhurried, so free of urgency or triumph, that it made his previous stillness seem like a choice rather than a limitation. He adjusted his cuffs. He picked up the briefcase. And he walked toward the courtroom door, not under escort, not flanked by officers, but on his own feet at his own pace, with his back as straight as it had been when he entered. He did not turn around. He did not look at Harlan or Beckham or the judge or the students or the clerk who had made the TikTok edit. He simply walked through the door, and it closed behind him with a sound so soft it might have been the room itself exhaling. And in the silence that followed, every person left behind understood that what had just ended was not a trial. What had just begun was. In the Judicial Coordination Room on the courthouse's 3rd floor, an old landline telephone produced a sound that was not a ring, but a single dry click like the safety mechanism being disengaged on a weapon. The duty officer, Patricia Hargrove, looked at the display, classified secure. She picked up the receiver. No greeting. No identification. 1 second of silence. Then a male voice, neither high nor low, neither fast nor slow. Every syllable engineered to bypass the conscious mind and land directly in the brainstem. Maintain the personnel status of the defendant. No sentencing, no transfer, no judgment, no public statement, no contact. 6 commands, 15 words. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Not disconnected dead. No dial tone, no click, just absolute silence. She relayed the message within 4 minutes. The police chief read it, and perspiration appeared along his hairline despite the corridor thermostat reading 18 degrees. He turned to his aide and whispered, "Who exactly were we trying?" The aide's mouth opened with automatic readiness, then closed again because he did not possess a single piece of information with which to answer. In his private chamber, Judge Pryor dialed a secure line he had memorized but never used in 30 years. His legal assistant answered on the second ring. Pryor's voice was low, his throat dry. Let me ask you, plainly, are we in the middle of a federal ethics test? The line went silent. Then the call, disconnected, cut cleanly from a level above. In a building with no public address, a team of analysts sat in front of screens displaying real-time data feeds from the courthouse. Heart rate variability, micro-expression analysis, voice stress patterns. They were not watching the trial. The trial was over. They were measuring something far more revealing than guilt or innocence. They were measuring character. On the main screen, the defendant's face appeared no name, only an identifier, TIE-0. An analyst tapped the table 3 times. The data collection phase was complete. Everyone in that courtroom had been caught inside a test they didn't know had started. There was no alarm bell, no announcement, just the slowly tightening feeling that the people who had spent the morning judging a man were now being judged themselves by a standard they had never imagined existed. Derek Harlan did not remember leaving the courtroom. The journey from the defendant's bench to the parking lot existed in his memory as a gap, a blackout of motion between 2 fixed points. The moment he saw the badge and the moment he found himself sitting in the driver's seat of his car, with his hands on the steering wheel and the engine off, staring through the windshield at a concrete wall. His hands would not stop shaking. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, but his fingers seemed to belong to someone else. Beneath his own too-fast breathing looping like a corrupted audio file, he could hear his own voice from 90 minutes ago. Somebody dragged this animal back to whatever hole he crawled out of. The words didn't sound like his anymore. They sounded like evidence. His phone buzzed. 6 texts, 2 missed calls, 1 voicemail. The first text from his partner, "Bro, tell me that video isn't you." The second from an Academy friend, "Harlan, what did you do?" The fourth from his union rep, "Call me immediately. Urgent." The 6th from his wife, "Caitlin showed me the video. She's been watching it on repeat. She won't stop crying. Come home and explain this. Now." He tried to log into the department's internal system from his phone. The screen refreshed to a single line of red text, "Account suspended, pending internal review." He drove home. His wife was standing in the kitchen, the video playing on the tablet propped against the toaster. She did not ask what happened. She didn't need to. "Kate's in her room," she said, and said nothing more. He walked down the hallway to his daughter's bedroom. Caitlin was 14, sitting cross-legged on her bed with her phone in her hand, the screen glowing with a clip that had already been shared 40,000 times. She looked up. Her eyes were red, but no longer wet, as if the crying had been replaced by something harder. "Dad, is that you?" Laughing at the FBI director. Derek Harlan had spent his adult life making people answer questions they didn't want to answer. But standing in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom, looking into the eyes of the one person in the world whose opinion of him mattered more than the badge, he discovered that there are questions that cannot be answered, not because the answer is complicated, but because the answer is the simplest thing in the world, and saying it out loud would make it real. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He stood there, a man in a uniform that no longer meant what it used to mean in a house that no longer felt like a safe place, in a silence that was not the powerful silence of a man in control, but the empty, hollow silence of a man who has just heard his own laughter played back to him by his daughter, and realized with a finality that settled into his bones like winter that some sounds cannot be unheard, and some mornings cannot be taken back. The video was 38 seconds long. That was all it took to end careers, collapse reputations, and force an entire nation to look at itself in a mirror it had been avoiding for generations. Shaky phone-recorded footage from the gallery benches, a trembling hand, and a whispered narration. "Yo, is he serious right now?" The TikTok music playing on an officer's phone. Harlan's voice unmistakable in its contempt, and then the badge. Silver and blue and eagle-crowned, held at chest height by a man who had not said a word for an hour, and the sound that followed was the absolute absence of sound, a vacuum so complete that the recording seemed to glitch. By 9:43 a.m. it was on Facebook. By 10:12 Twitter. By 11:03 trending in all 50 states. Within 3 hours, 5 million views. News outlets scrambled. Officers mocked defendant for having no lawyer. Defendant didn't need one. The headlines didn't need embellishment. The truth was more dramatic than fiction. The Ridgemont County Police Department's social media pages were flooded within the hour. Every post from the past year, community barbecue announcements. Recruitment drives a photograph of an officer helping a child across the street, buried beneath thousands of comments demanding accountability. No official response was posted. The silence from the department was deafening, but amid the hundreds of thousands of interactions, one comment appeared that was different. No likes, no verified badge, no profile picture, no posting history. Just a single line, "You just shot into the dark." Below it, 3 dots appeared briefly, then vanished. The account was set to private. Within 15 minutes, the comment was deleted, the account suspended. Most people never saw it. But for those who had spent careers in the periphery of intelligence work, those 3 words were not a comment. They were a signal, and the signal meant what you are watching is not what you think it is. Harlan saw the video for the first time on his daughter's phone, but by noon he couldn't escape it. It played on the television in his living room when his wife turned on the local news. It played in the gas station when he tried to fill his tank and the attendant recognized his face. It played in the reflection of his own car window when he sat in the driveway, unable to go inside, and although that last one was only in his mind, it was the loudest of all. He pulled his phone out and typed a message to Beckham. 2 words. "Call me," and stared at the screen waiting for the 3 dots. That would mean his supervisor, his protector. The man who had nodded approval for everything he'd ever done was still there. The dots never appeared. The message sat there delivered but unread, as permanent and as useless as everything else he had said that morning. Not everyone watched the video and felt outrage. Within hours, a counter-narrative began to build from the same reservoir of resentment and tribal loyalty that surfaces whenever an institution perceived as ours comes under threat from an authority perceived as theirs. It started in closed forums where law enforcement officers speak freely. He was tested unfairly. It was entrapment. Why didn't he identify himself? The most shared post was a photograph of Harlan from 3 years earlier, grinning in his dress uniform at a community event. This man served his community for over a decade. One bad day, and they want to destroy him. Conservative commentators reframed the story. The FBI director deliberately deceived local law enforcement. He entered under false pretenses and provoked officers into reactions, now being used to discredit an entire department. Edited clips circulated showing only Blackwell's blank expression, his composure reframed as menace, his dignity transformed into threat, the ancient trick of making a black man's calm look dangerous. A Facebook group defending Harlan accumulated over 8,000 members in its first day. If Blackwell wanted respect, he should have dressed like he deserved it. These people always want special treatment. He sat there like a statue because he wanted this to happen. Nina, the mother from the courtroom gallery, sat on her couch, scrolling through the debate with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the argument and everything to do with the fact that her son had asked, "Is he a bad guy?" and she had not answered. She opened a notes app and began typing. 3 sentences. Deleted. 4 more. Deleted again. Then she saved the draft and closed the app because the words she wanted to say were not ready yet, and she knew with the instinct of a mother who understands that some things must be said at exactly the right moment or not at all, that the time for her voice had not yet come. But it was coming. Monday morning arrived in the Ridgemont County Police Department the way dawn arrives in a hospital, not with hope, but with the cold light of consequences. On 7 desks lay manila envelopes, each containing a single sheet bearing the departmental seal, a name, a badge number, and 3 paragraphs of language that managed to be simultaneously dry as dust and devastating as a wrecking ball. Suspended pending internal investigation. Derek Harlan's envelope was placed at the exact center of his desk. He arrived at 7:15 wearing civilian clothes because his uniform had felt that morning like something he no longer had the right to put on. He read the first paragraph and set it down without finishing the second. The career he had spent 11 years constructing, the identity he had built, brick by brick, out of fear and force and the polished surface of a badge that reflected everything, except the truth, was now subject to a process he could not influence, could not charm, could not intimidate, and could not make disappear by filing it under resolved internally. Beckham's notice carried different weight. His suspension cited not what he had done, but what he had failed to do. Failure of supervisory duty. Complicity through documented inaction. Pattern of administrative suppression of civilian complaints within supervised unit. His wife had asked him the night before, quietly, without accusation, "How long did you know this was wrong?" He hadn't answered because the honest answer always, "I always knew," was not the kind of thing a man says out loud to the woman who married him, believing he was decent. Judge Pryor was not suspended. The notification on his desk carried no administrative penalty, but something arguably worse. A formal notice of judicial conduct, review the first in his 30-year career. He sat in his chamber staring at the gavel that was supposed to represent authority and impartiality, the gavel he had chosen not to lift when the tick-tock music played, when the mockery escalated, when a man's shoulder was about to be grabbed by another man who had no right to touch him. And he understood for the first time that the tool had been empty for longer than he cared to admit. The hallways felt different. The firm, confident footsteps that usually echoed through the corridors had been replaced by something quieter, the shuffling, uncertain gait of people who have discovered that the ground beneath them is not as solid as they assumed. Voices were lower. Eye contact was rare. The break room held only the sound of coffee being poured, each movement performed with the self-conscious care of people who suddenly feel watched even when they are alone. The FBI did not arrive with sirens. They arrived with jurisdiction, which is quieter and infinitely more terrifying. At 4:30 a.m., while the building sat empty, a team of 6 technicians arrived in an unmarked van. Dark uniforms, no name tags, no visible affiliation. One scanned a QR code from a tablet, and the main server terminal displayed Authorized FBI Oversight Commission. Within 7 minutes, full administrative control had been transferred. Hard drives were sealed. Internal email accounts frozen. Body cam footage archives, personnel records, disciplinary files, every digital artifact from the past decade, now accessible only through a portal controlled by Washington. The internet connection went dark. All local access privileges rerouted to FBI headquarters. The smell of the empty corridors at that hour, floor wax and recycled air, and the faint metallic tang of server rooms running hot would later become, for the overnight dispatch officer who watched it happen, the smell of something ending. The state's chief of police attempted to enter his own office at 8:15 a.m. Keycard deactivated. Computer locked. He shouted at a guard, "I'm the one in charge here." The guard kept his eyes on the floor. "We're following directive orders, sir." The bitterness on the chief's face was not the bitterness of a man losing power. It was the bitterness of a man realizing power was never his to lose. It had been on loan, and the lender had just called in the debt. On paper, nobody was arrested. Nobody was fired. Not a single weapon drawn. But the effect was more devastating than any theatrical gesture could have been, because what the FBI had done was not punish the department. It had simply removed the department's ability to operate autonomously and replaced it with federal oversight so complete that every keystroke now passed through a system that answered to the same man the department had spent a Monday morning mocking. A federal political figure appeared on a nightly news program, sat in front of a dark background, stared directly into the camera, spoke a single sentence, and left. "I think we just took a test and failed." Harlan, watching the broadcast from his living room couch in the clothes he had been wearing for 2 days, heard that sentence and understood for the first time with complete clarity that what was happening to him was not a punishment administered by a man he had insulted. It was a mirror held up by an entire nation, and his face was in it, and there was nowhere in the world he could stand where his reflection would not follow him. Renata Okafor worked from a 1-bedroom apartment at a desk cluttered with encrypted hard drives and 3 separate laptops. She was the kind of journalist that institutions feared not because she was loud, but because she was patient, the kind who spent months pulling threads until the entire garment unraveled, and who published without asking permission, because permission was the first tool powerful people used to prevent the truth from seeing daylight. The file arrived routed through 7 proxy servers. Subject line decoded to 2 words. Project Mirror. She opened it. Ethical Compliance. Live Experiment. Filed by I. Blackwell. Date of original submission, 3 years prior. Objective to monitor and assess levels of ethical deviation within local law enforcement agencies operating under non-intervention conditions. Method-controlled placement of a high-ranking federal official in a vulnerable civilian role within a judicial setting. No identification. No intervention. No defense. Record and analyze all behavioral responses. At the bottom, in bold, do not disclose the identity of the subject until the observed system has fully reflected upon its own behavior. 8 concealed cameras had been installed in the courtroom's blind spots 3 weeks before the trial. Audio devices embedded in ceiling fixtures and the judge's bench. A biometric monitoring system deployed through sensors placed during a routine cleaning that was neither routine nor a cleaning. Every laugh recorded. Every mocking gesture cataloged. Every tick-tock edit, every kicked briefcase. Every complicit silence captured, time-stamped and filed as data points in a behavioral prediction model that Blackwell had submitted 3 years earlier. A model that predicted with chilling accuracy exactly how a room full of law enforcement officers would behave when confronted with a silent black man who offered no resistance, no identification, and no reason for them to believe he was anything other than what they assumed. A behavioral surveillance report noted with precision the target's stillness triggers oppressive reflexes from observers. As predicted, the less resistance, the more primal the system behaves. Renata released the data at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. CNN, America's moral gatekeeper, has spoken. NBC. If he's the one on trial, then who is truly being judged? BBC, the greatest moral experiment in modern American history. A senator at a reform summit. I'm not afraid of a man like Isaiah Blackwell. I'm afraid that we need a man like him to make us realize we're wrong. The consequences did not arrive in the form that people expected. There were no perp walks. What arrived instead was absence. People disappearing from the system, their names vanishing from personnel databases, their access credentials dissolving overnight, their professional existences erased with the silent efficiency of a correction applied to a spreadsheet nobody is supposed to see. 3 senior officers did not report for the Monday briefing. No emails sent. Desks untouched, coffee cups still warm, family photos still angled toward empty chairs, but their personnel files had vanished. An HR coordinator tried to access one and received an automated call within 90 seconds. Do not attempt again. Harlan's old body cam footage was pulled by a federal analysis team. They found the pattern 8 years of arrest records showing the same structure black and brown suspects detained on vague charges reports written with identical boilerplate suspect displayed aggressive posture complaints filed and dismissed by Beckham's office with 2 words and a signature. For every 5 arrests in minority neighborhoods, 1 complaint. In 8 years, not a single hearing, not one. Beckham's enabling was documented memos praising Harlan's efficient arrest metrics during the same quarters when complaints peaked. The correlation was not subtle. It was the documented evidence of a man who had built his career on the principle that results justify methods and who had never once been forced to explain to the people, harmed by those methods, why their pain did not appear in any official record. The betting pool was discovered 6 officers had wagered whether Blackwell would snap or cry before the trial ended. Winner received a $50 gift card. Every participant flagged. The platinum-haired law student was identified through cross-referencing gallery records with university databases. He withdrew from his law program before the end of the week. Clara Jennings submitted a voluntary statement to Internal Affairs, 4 pages single-spaced. She described what she saw, what she heard, what she felt when the pen fell and she looked into the defendant's eyes, and why she stayed silent. The final paragraph. I knew something was wrong. I felt it in my body. But I chose my silence over his dignity, and that makes me part of what happened, not a witness to it. An anonymous message appeared in an internal departmental chat group. The FBI doesn't punish. They erase. Check your access. No one replied. The group fell silent from that day forward. The courtroom trial was the match. The buried files were the gasoline that had been pooling beneath the department's floor for years. The federal oversight team started in the basement archives, rusting file cabinets, boxes labeled by year dust that only accumulates on things deliberately forgotten. The air down there smelled like mildew and old ink and the particular mustiness of paper that has been left to yellow in darkness. And when the first cabinet was opened, the metal groaned like something waking from a long, unwilling sleep. 212 unresolved civilian complaints spanning 8 years. A third never reviewed past initial intake. 41 specifically naming Harlan, each bearing the same terminal notation. Resolved internally, no further action. Each notation signed by Beckham. 14 reclassified as priority cases when cross-referenced with hospital records and independent witness statements never incorporated into official files. A pattern emerged when complaint timelines were overlaid with Harlan's award history. 11 of 14 cases aligned with periods when Harlan was being recognized as Officer of the Quarter. The commendations and complaints were not coincidences, they were the same events viewed from opposite sides of a wall. One complaint from a single mother in 2019. He said to me, "You want your kid to keep going to school, right?" Just like that. No yelling. Just that one sentence, and I understood that if I kept talking, something would happen to my family that nobody would be able to prove. Another from a man admitted to the ER the same night he was arrested for resisting a traffic stop. 3 broken teeth. A 20-centimeter bruise lacerations consistent with being forced to asphalt. The arrest report subject was combative and required physical restraint. The hospital records told a different story. The same culture that produced laughter at a silent man's expense had been producing silence at the expense of those who tried to speak for years. The briefcase that Harlan kicked contained the badge that ended his career. But the files in the basement contained something worse. The names of every person whose suffering had been converted into a performance metric and filed away as evidence that the machine was working. Isaiah Blackwell did not hold a press conference. He did not appear on television. What he did was build something quietly, methodically, with the same controlled precision he had demonstrated in the courtroom. A civilian review board, genuinely independent, its members selected through a process that excluded current and former law enforcement officers. It included a former public defender, a university professor specializing in racial data analysis, a community organizer wrongfully arrested in 2011, and a young man named Darius, whose front teeth had been broken by an officer who was never investigated, whose complaint had been one of the 212 files recovered from the basement. Darius was not appointed as a symbol. He was appointed because he understood from the inside of his own body what it felt like when the institutions designed to protect you became the instruments of your harm. All use of force incidents now required review within 30 days. Officers with 3 or more civilian complaints within 6 months were automatically flagged and required to submit written responses to each complainant directly under their own name in language a person without legal training could understand. An anonymous civilian feedback system was deployed. After any police interaction, citizens could submit assessments through an encrypted portal. AI tracked recurring patterns. The system was diagnostic, not punitive. Its purpose was to create conditions in which the department could no longer pretend it didn't know what its officers were doing. An open data portal published aggregated feedback monthly. The department did not curate or filter. The numbers spoke for themselves. A single line was posted on the department's public website. If you once filed a complaint and never received an answer, you now have the right to request a review. We are obligated to respond. No attorney required. Arthur Givens saw the announcement on a Tuesday morning, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. He read it twice. Then he set down his tablet, removed his glasses, cleaned them with the hem of his shirt, the way he always did when he needed a moment to think, and reached into his breast pocket for the photograph of Terence, the creased school portrait he'd carried against his heart for 6 years. He looked at it for a long time, at the smile he hadn't seen since that afternoon at the bus stop, and then he picked up his phone and dialed the number he hadn't called in all those years. The phone rang twice. Terence picked up, and the silence that followed was not the silence of estrangement or anger, but the silence of two people who have been waiting for something to change without believing it ever would. I think Arthur said quietly, "It might be time to tell your story to someone who's required to listen." The room had no name, no event title on the door, no agenda distributed, no calendar invitation. Chairs arranged in a semicircle on polished concrete, overhead lights dimmed to a level that allowed faces to be seen but not read. A large screen remained blank, a dark mirror waiting to be filled. The people in those chairs were senior officials, department heads, training coordinators, and intelligence officers. They had been told to attend, not invited told. They arrived without knowing what they would hear or from whom, and the not knowing was doing exactly what it was designed to do, making them afraid, not of danger, but of relevance. Then the door opened and Isaiah Blackwell walked in as if he had never left. No one introduced him. He wore a dark gray suit with no insignia, no badge. One hand held a thin leather notebook. The other was in his pocket. His shoes made a sound on the concrete that was precise and unhurried, each step placed with the deliberate rhythm of someone who has learned that the pace at which you enter a room determines how much power you carry into it. He walked to the exact center of the semicircle and stood there, his eyes moving slowly across the faces with the measured attention of an architect inspecting a structure he designed and now wanted to see in its completed form. Every person he looked at remembered something. The memories surfaced involuntarily like objects rising from a lake that has been drained. A mid-level employee remembered unplugging the coffee machine when Blackwell tried to use it a year earlier. For people who work here, not drifters. A senior administrator remembered refusing to admit him. His face says he's not worth meeting. A veteran instructor remembered using Blackwell's photograph in a training slide labeled "Improper Posture in the Face of Authority," telling cadets that silence isn't always strength, sometimes it's stupidity. All of it. Every small cruelty, every offhand remark, every laugh that seemed harmless in the moment surfaced like the evidence it had always been, and the man responsible for their discomfort was standing at the center with the same stillness, the same silence, the same absolute composure that had made them laugh at him when they thought he was nobody, and that now made them unable to look at him because they knew he was everything. He spoke 7 words. They came out evenly, without emphasis, without force. I came to see the system reflect. Nobody exhaled. Nobody applauded. This was not a performance. This was a reckoning. They were not the audience. They were the subjects. And the man who had spent a morning being mocked in a courtroom had come finally not to punish them, not to lecture them, but simply to stand in front of them and let them see what their laughter had failed to destroy. He did not stay. He left exactly as he had arrived, without sound, without the spotlight, without looking back, and the door closed behind him with the same soft finality that had ended the courtroom trial weeks earlier. A young agent in the last row opened a notebook and wrote a single line, pressing so hard that the ink bled through. His silence weighed heavier than any verdict. Nina published her post on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the trial. She had revised it 17 times, deleted it twice, almost abandoned it entirely. But the question her son had asked, "Is he a bad guy?" Mom had not stopped echoing, and the silence with which she had answered it had not stopped feeling like a failure. "My son is 5 years old," she wrote. "He asked me if the man in the chair was a bad guy. I didn't answer him. I pulled him close and bowed my head because I was afraid. Not of the officers or the judge. I was afraid of the question itself because I knew the answer was complicated in a way that a 5-year-old shouldn't have to understand. The bad guys were the ones in uniform. The bad guys were laughing. And the man in the chair, the one everyone was mocking, turned out to be the most powerful person in the room. My son saw it before any of us did. He asked the right question. We were the ones who didn't have the courage to answer it. Shared 400,000 times in 3 days. Not because it was political, because it was a mother's voice saying what millions of parents had felt, the piercing realization that the world their children are growing up in cannot tell the difference between a threat and a human being. Arthur Givens's grandson, Terrence, walked into the Civilian Review Board's office on a Monday morning, wearing the same nervous expression he had worn 6 years earlier when officers handcuffed him for standing at a bus stop. He was 23 now, taller, quieter, with the careful posture of someone who has learned to make himself small in spaces not designed for him. Arthur sat beside him, not as a representative, but as a grandfather, a man whose primary qualification for being in the room was that he loved the person next to him and had been waiting 6 years for someone to ask. Terrence gave his statement. The afternoon he was arrested, the questions he wasn't allowed to answer, the handcuffs that clicked shut while he explained he was waiting for the 4:15 bus. The 3 months afterward spent afraid to leave home. The basketball season missed. The scholarship interview he didn't attend because the thought of entering a building with security guards made his chest tighten in a way he could not control. I stopped believing anyone would ask, he said. And the review board member taking notes paused with her pen above the paper, because the simplicity of that sentence, the bone-deep resignation of a young man taught by experience that his story did not matter, was more damning than any legal argument she had ever heard. Arthur reached over and placed his hand on Terrence's arm, and the gesture carried the weight of 6 years of helpless fury finally finding a place to rest. In his breast pocket, the creased photograph of Terrence's school portrait sat against his heart, no longer a relic of what was lost, but a compass pointing toward what might still be recovered. Clara Jennings's op-ed appeared in the Ridgemont County Herald on a Saturday. No photograph, no sensationalized headline, just her name and 8 paragraphs of plain language. I sat in that courtroom for over an hour. I heard every joke. I saw the blood on his collar. I felt the wrongness like a physical weight pressing on my chest. And I said nothing. I want to say I was afraid, and I was. But fear is not an excuse. It is a description of a choice. I chose my silence over his dignity. This is not an apology. An apology implies the harm can be repaired by words. This is a record. I am writing it so that the next person who sits in my chair will have a harder time choosing to say nothing. Harlan sat alone in the kitchen of a house that no longer felt like his. His wife had taken Caitlin to her mother's house 4 days earlier. His badge sat on the table, the same badge he had polished every morning for 11 years. The badge that had made him feel invincible, the way a child feels invincible wearing a costume. He did not touch it. He could not pick it up, and he could not put it away. It sat between the salt shaker and a folded newspaper, reflecting the kitchen light in a way that made it look for the first time like what it actually was, a piece of metal. His phone lay beside it, screen dark. Beckham's number still showing the message he'd sent 2 days ago. Call me delivered. Red never answered. The man who had nodded approval for everything Harlan had ever done had disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. And in the silence of that unanswered message, Harlan understood something that no disciplinary board could have taught him, that the loyalty of enablers lasts exactly as long as the enabled remains useful and not 1 second longer. Renata Okafor published her final piece not about Blackwell, not about Harlan, but about the 212 complainants. Their names printed for the first time. The article's closing line, Blackwell didn't need a voice. He gave one back to everyone who had been silenced before him. The morning was early autumn, the air carrying that particular crispness that arrives when summer has released its grip, but winter has not yet closed its fist, a transitional season that feels, if you pay attention, like the world pausing between one version of itself and another. The trees around the FBI Academy at Quantico were beginning to turn their leaves, shifting from green to gold in the gradual, irreversible way that change always happens when it is real. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly, leaf by leaf. Until one morning, you look up and realize the landscape is different from what you remember. A young officer newly assigned to FBI headquarters stepped through the main entrance of the third-floor corridor, the executive level. Fresh suit, new name tag, unscuffed shoes. He walked the way all new recruits walk in their first week carefully, as if the floor itself might be evaluating his step. He passed offices with frosted glass doors, each bearing a nameplate in standardized federal font. He passed conference rooms and a long corridor lined with framed photographs spanning nearly a century. He did not stop to examine any of them because he was headed somewhere specific, not by assignment, but by the gravitational pull of a story that every person who wore the uniform he was wearing had been told, retold, and required to study. And then he saw it. A large glass door, polished to a clarity that made it almost invisible, set into the wall at the end of the corridor like a window between the present and something larger. On it, etched in gold ink so subtle you had to stand directly in front to read the words, Isaiah Blackwell, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He stopped. Not because the name surprised him. He had read it in briefings and case studies in the training module every recruit completed before their first week ended. He stopped because standing in front of that door in this hallway at this moment in his own still-forming career, the name was no longer text on a screen or a headline. It was real. It was here. It was cut into glass at the heart of the institution he had just pledged his life to serve. He looked at the glass, and what he saw first was not the name. It was his own reflection, faint, transparent, overlaid against the gold lettering like a ghost superimposed on a monument. A young face, tense and uncertain, staring back at him with the expression of someone standing at the beginning of something they do not fully understand. Behind his reflection, the name remained fixed, unmoving, as permanent as anything carved into glass can be. He thought about the stories he had studied. The officer who closed an elevator door on Blackwell because his skin was too dark. The barista who refused to serve him because he didn't look like someone who belonged. The guard who said people who leave no trace aren't to be trusted. All of them gone now. Not terminated, just no longer part of the record. Their names replaced by the silence they had once inflicted on others. He raised his hand and placed his fingertips against the glass. Not to open the door. Just to verify that the surface was real, that the cold, smooth solidity beneath his fingers was not a projection or a metaphor, but a physical object bearing the name of a man who had once sat in a courtroom and allowed himself to be mocked by people who believed the loudest voice in the room was the strongest, and who had proven without raising his voice at all that they were wrong. He lowered his hand. He stepped back. He did not take a photograph. He did not mention the moment to anyone. He simply turned and continued down the hallway, his new shoes making their first real sound against the floor, each step a little firmer than the one before. At the end of the corridor, where autumn light filtered through a frosted window, the first page of a new training document hung in a simple black frame. No date, no author, no departmental seal. Just a single line printed in a font so plain it could have been typed on any keyboard in any office in any city in the country. Justice doesn't need proclamation. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the trees surrounding the academy, carrying the last warmth of a season that was ending and the first chill of something new. Somewhere in a small town in another state, Arthur Givens sat on his front porch with his grandson beside him, neither of them speaking, because for the first time in 6 years, the silence between them did not feel like absence. It felt like trust, like the beginning of a conversation that would take the rest of their lives to finish, and neither of them was in a hurry. And on a glass door that no one opened, but everyone passed in a hallway where the light fell just right in the late afternoon, a name remained, not as a title, not as a warning, not as a monument to power, but as proof simple and unadorned that the quietest man in the room changed everything without ever raising his voice. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the rooms you've sat in, the laughter you've heard, the silence you chose when you could have spoken, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that refuse to stay quiet, and tell us in the comments what would you have done in that courtroom.